We think that these are things like serious land reform, eminent domain where the state has the right to take the lands, and regular doleouts that happen to the population. We don't disagree with the mindsets that states should focus on increasing the standard of living. The best question is, how do we best get there in terms of allowing sustainable development to take place? Clashes will be interesting. On to my first argument in terms of on capacity building and sustainability. On the negative, we believe that there should be more structure within markets. Before that, sir, we think that private sectors need to focus in complementary with the government, because the government can't bear the brunt of the burden, because we believe in an entirety of a strong and upper middle class. But before that, yes, sir.
Sir, are you happy with attaching any conditions to development aid?
Yes, we are happy with attaching development conditions with this development aid. That's why there are things like monitoring policies within governments to ensure that development aid actually goes to the places that it's devoted for. Yeah. But more than that, we think that states should scale back on the provision of social services. Because what happens when you scale back is that there is a private sector that you can rely on, because the private sector, no thank you, is more efficient in terms of allowing things like efficient education, jobs, the quality, and it creates healthy competition for other industries to come in as well. Why do we think this is so? We think, no thank you, this is so because of the huge capital outlay that's needed or capital flight for infrastructure to take place. What's not mutually exclusive, or what happens more likely on our side, is that the environment is more conducive for businesses to happen. We think that this is true because you have things like, say, security that's already taken care of by the state. No thank you. We think that what happens is, at best, you have, to some extent, which is incredibly unlikely, you have base capital, but there are no institutions or no auxiliary institutions for businesses to come in and invest in these areas, as opposed to having a conducive environment for businesses to take place. We think that these are things like, say, security, roads, infrastructures. In a moment, sir, more likely than not, we think that this can be characterized through examples like Venezuela, where people were made less and taxed incredibly to the extent of hyper progressive taxation. So they eventually just left, and we think it's going to affect businesses in the long term.
What we didn't propose,
but yes,
why would including 20% of Kurdish engineers create an inconducive environment for businesses to thrive?
Because in its entirety, this 20% can lead to things like, say, can lead to more conducive business environments. Like, we think in its entirety, you discourage investors from taking place. Look at the Philippines, for example. If you have this imminent form of, say, the imminent domain, for example, then you're only allotting, like, say, 6% to one particular investor. So and like, say, for example, the sugarcane industry. Because the returns are not enough in terms of the investments, there is a deficit. So we think that this incentivizes the agricultural industry, for example, in investing more. Because now there is the threat of the state taking these lands away. So we think that your characterization of the debate doesn't cater to things like this. But more than that, we think that you are, no thank you, I think it's too many. But we think that at best you put people in a straitjacket. We're not saying that people will be poor. In fact, we think that this is less likely. Because let's say, for example, we think that a poorer person, no thank you, in the US, it's much better off than a poor person in the Philippines. So to some extent, when you're talking about a bare minimum standard, it is still ultimately reached. Because what happens with their policy? We think that radical policies promote cycles of dependence. Like, we think what's going to happen with regards to these minorities especially is that you make them more dependent on the government. Like, there's less structures that complement each other. And when you randomly please people, to some extent, the benefits that are going to be received are more short-term. And what happens and especially in developing countries and post-conflict societies, we don't think that there is much trust, or we think corrupt governments are more likely to use this for both backs. So we think you have to take into account the ideas of, say, making sure that there is sustainability in the investments that are made. Before my sixth. No one? Great. So we think that we think what happens is the cycles of dependence or cycles of sustainability have to happen. More than that, we feel that in terms of allowing proper integration and businesses to invest in the long term, because there's no fear of the governments taking most of the returns that they make, because there's a strong upper and higher middle class, and you have a standard of living that increases rapidly and consistently, it's more likely to occur on our side. But more than that, we feel that most of the money should go to things like, for example, go to tax breaks that you give private industries, because the government cannot always bear the brunt of things like healthcare, things like, say, education, because these private industries also promote things like competition that exists among them. So there's an incentive for everyone to come in because they're able to get the returns of what happens. So for all these reasons, we're more than proud to oppose.
Leader of opposition, deputy prime minister.
For the amount of discussion that was occurring on the opposition bench during Prabha's speech, not a lot of that material came out in the Leader of Opposition's speech, ladies and gentlemen. It gets a bit uncomfortable for me on that bench, having to sit through a Leader of Opposition speech who's trying his best to reach the 7-minute bell, ladies and gentlemen, with the lack of material that he had. We had nothing from the Leader of Opposition. Literally, Mr. Speaker, nothing. We had no stance. We had no model. What are they willing to stand for? What are they willing to defend, ladies and gentlemen? Are they happy with, they said they're happy attaching conditions to developmental aid, never telling us why these conditions are phenomenally different from any of the other conditions they are willing to defend. They told us that our case was somehow cowardly, never telling us what the intrinsic problems about setting conditions of how this aid and how that wealth is distributed to people, what the intrinsic problems with that were. We got nothing of that, ladies and gentlemen. It's a bit, I feel a bit upset because, when you keep your best two speakers for the, send the sacrificial lamb first, keep the next best two speakers. That doesn't give me a lot to do, and that means, ladies and gentlemen, I've got to start making stuff up, right? But we'll love to hear from them. I'm sure they're itching to get up here to correct the wrongs, ladies and gentlemen. Yep. The first thing that I want to talk about in my speech is the moral imperative of the West. Why the West is somehow, directly perpetuating these inequalities, why they have that moral duty. Second, I'm going to talk to you about economic growth and why equitable economic growth is a lot better and a lot more stable on our side, directly clashing with what the previous speaker was talking about. Thirdly, I'm going to talk about social development, why there's better harmony in the countries that we want to do this for. And fourthly, talking about creating top-down change. But before that, a couple of rebuttals that don't fit. The first thing that the Leader of Opposition, the first bit of the fixed material they have, sit down please, madam, first is that this whole capitalist free market idea, right? Basically, the free market solves everything. We're not really sure how investors and stockbroking is anyway involved in distributing developmental aid, but it's all right, we'll take that material at its best. We don't think so, ladies and gentlemen. We think in these countries, a lot of the wealth and a lot of the money that comes from developmental aid is given by these governments to their cronies, to their friends, ladies and gentlemen, to their fellow cabinet members, and they're the ones who get to run these projects. We think under your model, at best, what you have is you have this huge income gap. Yes, thank you very much. Huge income gap between these two classes. You have an elite class that have all the money and have all the projects and have all the contracts, and you have other people, minorities and others, minor religions, who have nothing. Secondly, he talked to you about social backlash. People are going to get upset about this. We think, ladies and gentlemen, at best, that even if people do get upset, they're going to direct that blame and that fault to the West. We don't think people are going to start shooting other people or killing other people on the streets, because essentially the West are the ones setting these conditions, and it's the West's money. But secondly, on a second level, we don't think the minority groups, the ones that we're trying to help, will ever, go through the same backlash that you talked about. Because we got their backs, ladies and gentlemen, and they know that. They know the West is looking out for them. So we're talking about Hindus in Bangladesh, or we're talking about Kurds in Turkey and Syria. These people know that the West are looking out for them. That's less likely that they're gonna be, reacting violently towards this model. My first argument, Mr. Speaker, the moral imperative of the West. I have two levels of analysis for this. Firstly, because the West somehow historically perpetuated these inequalities in the first place. Because when the West left these colonies, when they ran these colonies and then left, ladies and gentlemen, a lot of the wealth, a lot of the capital was given to monarchies, they were given to elite classes, elite families, ladies and gentlemen, and the wealth stopped there. given that, a lot of these families and a lot of these people were able to develop far beyond other minority groups, Mr. Speaker. We think it is the West, so the Assads and the Gaddafis, Mr. Speaker, the Shinawatras, for example. These are the families and the classes that were able to take advantage and able to compete, able to be successful while other people weren't. But secondly, we think that the West always stands for preventing the tyranny of majority. We think it's morally unfair that other individuals, because they are of different race or different religions, or they came out of a conflict before, Mr. Speaker, don't have the opportunity to develop as other people do. We think the West, given that that they're all for equality, they're all for they're all for equality, we think they have that moral imperative to do so. The second argumentation, just a bit later maybe, the second argumentation is about equitable economic growth, and this is linked to what I said before. Because what we're doing now is when you ensure that developmental aid goes to all minorities, or like women as well, ladies and gentlemen, we think what this means is that in the future, the contracts and the education reaches everybody. That means that when wealth, that means that we're creating good classes, we're creating good working classes within these groups, Mr. Speaker. That means in the future, we won't have, like huge ruling class elites in these countries, because essentially what happens is that developmental aid reaches everybody. Everyone has an equal opportunity, and everyone has equal chance to compete within these situations, Mr. Speaker. We think economic growth still happens under our model, but it happens more equitably, because everyone gets it, Mr. Speaker. Thirdly, I want to talk to you about social development, but before that, I want to hear from Sydney.
I don't think you understand the clash from opposition. We're not going to give out this development aid willy-nilly. We'll give out development aid and channel it towards the most productive elements in that country for long-term growth to happen.
Okay, I'd like to hear about these more productive elements a little bit later. Something maybe you should have told your first speaker while you were discussing that. The third thing, ladies and gentlemen, is about social development. Because we argue to you that in a lot of these countries, like Zimbabwe and Bangladesh, when the developmental aid is given to the cronies and to the government elites, we think it's hard, it makes the minority groups feel disenfranchised. When they feel disenfranchised, they feel isolated, they sometimes resort to violence, they sometimes resort to other means in order to get these opportunities, Mr. Speaker. We're talking about the Kurds, right? Like they've been at war with these countries for years, essentially, because they don't have the opportunities, they don't have the equal abilities. What we think is that when you ensure that development aid is spread out, we think it's less likely that these that minority groups will fight back. It's less likely that there will be some sort of social backlash, because we think now everyone feels included. But even if, Mr. Speaker, even if at best all they have to talk about social backlash is that maybe they'll get angry at the West. But the West can take that, Mr. Speaker. The United States can accept the blame for attempting to force these kind of inequalities onto these countries. We don't think that people on the ground are going to get hurt, Mr. Speaker. Lastly, we want to talk about attitude change, because essentially these governments, sometimes these governments do want to redistribute, do want to give equal opportunities to everyone, but because it's politically unstrategic for them to do so, because they have to appease their cronies and their ruling classes, Mr. Speaker. We think that by the West doing this, we think it shelters them a bit from that blame. And then when these things work, Mr. Speaker, in the long run, we think it's easier for these governments to implement these changes in a broader sense in their policies, in their laws, in their taxes, Mr. Speaker, because now essentially they said, hey, we have a working model, maybe it's not such a bad idea, maybe we should try it out as well. Ladies and gentlemen, they're going to come up here and they're going to flood as many arguments as they can within the next two speakers, but all we know is that they do not have a case, they do not have an objective, and we will not accept anything that comes any later than now. Thank you.
You told me to come now.
Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, what we saw from this side was really dirty, disgusting debating that should never be recorded in any debating community that holds itself to higher, more respectable standard. What is the policy they tried to present, and how did they make it seem benign, and why is that the death of them in today's debate? What did they give you? Oh, we want gender consultants. We want IP tribes to be represented in consultations as well. We want them to have a seat in the table. We want more participation. We want some of the profits to be shared to these people. Things that at face value seem like very easily conceivable things. But the softness of their policy is going to hurt them. So there are two things I'm going to do. I will assume two scenarios under their model. One, that it is soft and benign, and I'll tell you how that tokenism actually hurts the development process. And second, I will assume it's actually as hard as they want us to think it is, and why that's also harmful, because we're dynamic. What are the two scenarios? First is that it's a really token policy. You have a woman in the panel, you have 2 Kurdish people in the panel, you have IP chieftains in the panel. Didn't they just say that these countries are based on patronage politics, are based on networks and corruption and all those things? So what's going to stop? Because your policy is very checklist. As long as you have those faces there, as long as you have those names there. What's going to stop, as has happened many times, these countries to just stuff the panels with members of minority groups who are friendly to them. To just bribe certain tribal chieftains to agree to the development project. To just co-opt the elite members of those minority communities to support the project. This policy is more vulnerable to elite capture than if they just came here and bravely defended the case they were supposed to defend, because that would actually help them in this debate. So it's really superficial because it's a checkbox policy. Please sit down. But what makes it worse, right? What makes it worse is this time you have the illusion of consent. You have the illusion that people are okay with it. You deceive the world into thinking it's okay because you bribe certain people to sit in your panel so you can check that box. Please sit down. No. This is logic. You are assuming things, right? So that's assuming that the policy is token, because they were like, it's not so bad. We're not asking for a lot. That's true. You're asking for so little. It's so easy to co-opt, but it's dangerous. But let's assume there's some teeth in their policy. That we'll have some hardcore showdowns in these groups because different groups and different industries and different power players are being represented in the discussion. If I were an investor, I'm not even going to enter that country because I don't know what the outcome of those discussions are going to be, right? It makes all investors so risk averse because any single member of that group of every single demographic in the country that's being represented can hold the discussions hostage. This is not how business works, right? You want to create an environment of predictability. You want to create an environment of good risk management where they know the market they're getting into. Now, if I'm a mining investor and I'm like, I want to invest in mining, I want to invest in a logging industry, but then I'm going to be faced with like the chieftains of 8 different tribes, assuming these people actually have genuine power there. Then I'm going to have to deal with the chief economic minister and have to counterbid against other people. This is just too much stress. Please sit down. They will take their business elsewhere, and countries are just going to engage with other donors like China, who do not have these ridiculous, like, too good to be true model that they're asking for. Yes?
Essentially, you're saying that when we give development aid and attach conditions, something might go wrong. But that's a general problem of any developmental aid debate. Can you tell us why these conditions won't work?
Yes, friends. I think that's what I've been doing my entire speech. I'm saying it is vulnerable to paralysis because these different parts of society are never going to agree, especially, post-conflict states. I am also saying that if you think it's so easy to agree and this is not going to be a problem, then it's tokenism because it's also vulnerable to bribery, to people who to rig negotiations processes. So it's one or the other. The model is not conducive to this. You should have just debated the debate you're supposed to defend. So let's see, if an aid project for a dam is subject to consultations and an IP person says no, what are they going to do under their model? That's what they should defend. They should defend accepting that no of the tribe. We're not happy to do that. We think the state should have power of eminent domain because it is better able to decide how the resources are allocated across the country. Will the state do it alone? No. These same organizations that you're so proud of, the IMO and the IMF and the World Bank, have technical advisors who can assist the state in determining whether it's feasible or not, right? So again, what happens if, like, your different engineers disagree? What happens if you don't have experts from certain population groups? What if they don't understand how the money works? What if they don't understand how the industry works? Are you going to straitjacket the state, which is what Sanj said, into accepting all those members into the groups? You simply can't. You need to be sensitive to local context, right? They're not. They have a one-size-fits-all policy. What were we defending? We defend a climate that is conducive to business, to investment, to people thinking that it's not too risky to invest in a certain country. But before I go on,
Yeah, but we are limiting this aid. I mean, we are limiting this rule or this condition only to the funds that we're giving.
Oh wow, but your second speaker said it will rebuild the country and the economy and make the world such a great place. That's really silly. If your policy is so soft, then it's not doing anything in this world, but it imperils specifically extractive industries, it imperils the mining industry, it imperils like projects in conflict-ridden areas, right? So even if the harms are small, those things would have had huge benefits. So you have to make up your mind. Is your model going to have an effect on a huge part of society, or is it going to have an effect only on a small part of society? You're old enough, figure it out. So here, they try to present a straw man from our side of the house, right? They go, look, these societies are cronyistic and things like that. But we've told you, we accept that there will be some degree of corruption. That's going to happen either way, right? But we would rather it is the technical advisors deciding what happens than this hodgepodge of people who are never going to agree. Because once these industries get off the ground, they still create jobs. There's still a trickle down. There's still taxes to the government. The industries themselves are compelled to invest in their immediate environment. Why? That's where you recruit your human resources, right? You're invested in the safety and security of your business. You're invested in creating a consumer market even in that area to buy the things you are building, to subscribe to your services, which means we trust the experts and technocrats to make decisions first and impose this upon the state in consultation with state representatives than this weird hodgepodge process that they want that will go wrong regardless of what happens. Either the state steamrolls it by filling it with friendly cronies and people who are bribed, or no one ever agrees, nothing ever gets done, no one invests anything anywhere. Where will IMF, where will World Bank get funds? What donors will want to fund these kinds of initiatives and these kinds of standards? And if it's too difficult for a country to do anything, it will turn to China, which will say, love the market completely, and we all have no regulations. It's a silly policy. Do not reward this team. Thank you.
I wasn't called yet, but are you guys ready? So that team accuses us of disgusting debating without even chilling out with us at room parties and seeing more disgusting things that Brahma do, ladies and gentlemen. These are alright. This is alright debating, ladies and gentlemen. We propose a case where we can achieve things. We are not being idealistic, ladies and gentlemen, because what they wanted, and this is what they prepared at the staircase over there, ladies and gentlemen, that we are going to propose a radical policy to impose things on the country, ladies and gentlemen, which we think is not strategic. We think what we can do is that the money that we send, our money, we can decide on how this government spend our money, ladies and gentlemen. We think that's the most strategic and effective way because it doesn't become too controversial. It doesn't deter people from taking this aid because, ladies and gentlemen, we are not doing too much. But we think it gains momentum and it creates changes in the long run. What am I going to talk about? Firstly, the moral inconsistency that came from that side. They are okay with conditions, but at the same time, they are arguing that conditions make it difficult for governments to operate and do whatever they want with their funds. Why is it different when you attach conditions on human rights or democracy, ladies and gentlemen, or making abortion legal? Doesn't hamstring governments in making decisions, but suddenly when we impose this condition, it astronomically, or it really affects government's decision-making process. We don't think so. Secondly, they said that, let's sit down, they said that what they support is the free market, ladies and gentlemen. And the free market will definitely work itself and cater for minorities and people that are being marginalized in society. We think this is not true. We have to recognize that private corporations operate on a profit logic. They don't have a moral imperative to create social development within these countries. What happens most often than not, ladies and gentlemen, is that corporations come in and prey on the desperation of poor people. People don't get unfair deals, i.e. they don't get healthcare, for example. Their wage is terrible, ladies and gentlemen. And that is the kind of social development that they are supporting. Secondly, we think that corporations are more likely to outsource expertise, ladies and gentlemen, because they can't find expertise within these countries. So the kind of opportunities that you're trying to create, ladies and gentlemen, doesn't work because these corporations come in and they open a call center in India where people in Uganda suffer, ladies and gentlemen. Sure. Thirdly, we think that there's more likely, and in this day and age, ladies and gentlemen, where advancement in technology, corporations often use technology and hire less people, and the social inequality that you're trying to solve doesn't occur. They import experts from outside. They don't use the human capital there, ladies and gentlemen. We don't think people get a fair shot in this scenario. Thirdly, we think that they said it's not going to be effective. They will, because what Sharmila said apparently is that they will still promote friends from minority groups, and you don't change the problem. But at the same time, this is the government that they are supporting to run this free market that they are all talking about, ladies and gentlemen. Which one do you support? You can't have your cake and eat it too, ladies and gentlemen. We think they have to come out and show how status quo is better. Because under our policy, despite the fact that these governments may have interest in political patronage and helping their friends, we have monitoring systems. We have audits, ladies and gentlemen. The West will still provide assistance and make sure that these things can be mitigated. Although it might exist to a certain extent, ladies and gentlemen, we think at least we're including more people, and there is a probability of Kurds getting these positions rather than absolutely no opportunity on that side of the house. They have to show why there will be an imperative for governments to come up with this, right? In the worst case scenario, at least we help some people. Even if they're corrupted and they still promote their friend, at least this become a controversial issue in the country. I.e., minorities will start talking about it. Minorities will start putting pressure on government. When it becomes controversial, ladies and gentlemen, we think it is better than people being apathetic towards wanting to be included within society. That is what people are feeling right now. We are not included. We are isolated by our governments. Therefore, it's a losing fight. We shouldn't do anything. This creates the resurgence of morale and people wanting to be included within governments. But before I move on, she said "sir" 30 times. Yes.
There is a natural incentive for some degree of social consultation. Otherwise, people will get violent. Why do you need to straitjacket the government?
Because of the nature of the governments that you have talked about, the opportunities that you talk about, like they're not getting opportunities, they're still helping their friends, ladies and gentlemen. There is no natural incentive for governments to do this. Also because of the sentiments that are going on the ground, ladies and gentlemen, where people feel, the majority feel more superior than the minority, i.e. like, for example, in Pakistan or Afghanistan, where women can't become teachers because there's a normative predisposition that women are not as capable as men. What we do now is that we don't allow government to use people's sentiments to justify the policies that they do. Because now governments have plausible deniability. They can say that we're doing this not because we don't care about the majority, but because the West is imposing this onto us. And we don't think it's that controversial, ladies and gentlemen. It's not that we're trying to make these countries legalize abortion or gay marriages, ladies and gentlemen. We think this is okay. People will accept it. Lastly, she said that this will sacrifice merit because apparently when we pick 3 Kurdish people, it's like we are picking 3 Kurdish hobos that don't have any qualification, ladies and gentlemen, and putting them in boards. We don't think so. We think that there is a minimum qualification that people still have to meet. With our 30% or 20% quota that we have, people still have to fight for those positions, ladies and gentlemen, and the competition that we create doesn't create the culture of dependency that they wanted to talk about. I don't understand why including 3 Kurdish people in that particular project, ladies and gentlemen, will be so difficult. Why would discussion be so long, or bureaucracies, hamper the effectiveness of this particular policy? We don't think so. Because when we give them money and we have a plan of what they can do with the money, there are clear objectives that these people will have to work together and strive. How is it so difficult? If there is language barrier, we can buy them dictionaries, ladies and gentlemen, in order for them to work it out. We don't see how it makes things difficult. At the end of this debate, and lastly, ladies and gentlemen, Sharmila quickly said that if we impose this, suddenly people will turn to countries like China, and that will be worse. And I will deal with this. Yes, some countries may reject this and go to countries like China. But why is that bad? There wasn't any conclusion to that. But secondly, we think there is a lack of its incentive for countries to turn away from the West because they will have a natural incentive to build rapport and relationships with the West for geopolitical reasons as compared to going to other actors, ladies and gentlemen. Especially when the policies that we are proposing isn't that controversial. At the end of this debate, ladies and gentlemen, when you have some money and you are complicit with the social inequalities that happen within these countries, we think the money that you send should be distributed equitably for the people. Thank you very much.
Mr. Speaker, I started debating to weed out exactly people like this from debate politics in Malaysia. I'm very happy to stand by that. 3 issues. Number 1, model bash for me. Secondly, we're going to look at specifically what Sanjeev said. I'm pissed off that they completely ignored the 4 things which he mentioned. And thirdly, we're going to look at long-term change and why we should divorce ourselves from this quasi-communistic model which we would like to forward. Model bash. In conclusion, you'll realize after my speech that generally their case is what the debate generally should be about. Because they said that these countries and generally the spending power of this country is contingent upon the development aid which they get. That means the distribution of money which will come from the government and how the government's funding is also contingent on that development aid itself. That means whether we like it or not, the government will still need to institute radically redistributive policies when it comes to distributing resources on the ground, even if it's towards unproductive elements. So that's the first conclusion which we need to draw. The second model bash is that they said, guys, money now will be targeted upon creating system of patronages and cronies. And then they said, oh, our condition is same. It's like, it's unfair. Our condition is simple. Our condition is it must be channeled towards the most productive elements of that country, independent of all the racialized and religionized system which we like to talk about. And we are fine with that. And we think the point is, the point in which IMF wants a particular institution to be built in that area, the money should be channeled in that area. We think that's particularly simple. But assuming worst case scenario, right? Assuming worst case scenario that the system of patronages are simply too strong and we can't do anything about it. Your policy of tokenism would institutionally make situation worse. Sit down. They said, guys, don't worry. We have minimum qualifications. If we buy their characterization that these governments are so evil and pernicious that they can find a way to circumvent all laws, what the hell makes you think that they would follow all these minimum qualifications to begin with? But more importantly, even if they do follow the minimum qualification, who are the people who they will co-opt? They'll co-opt the Chinese minorities who are in support of them, probably the MCA people who you dislike. We think in that particular context it becomes far worse because it creates a false sense of illusion of representation, which means that any international action, sanction, domestic resentment will be deflected on the basis that there's a false sense of security in which your policy will ferment. On the best case scenario, you will still die. On the worst case scenario, your situation would make situation worse. But then they said, guys, there's no natural incentive for corporations to make things better, to enforce these laws. It's untrue, right? There's no incentive for the government to include like racial minorities. It's untrue. Our fates are intertwined to one another. The point in which those people are blighted with extreme poverty means it often leads to a position of desperation, criminality. They don't want to be unseated. They don't want to be civil strife in the country. You don't need to be in the majority for you to create tension, i.e. Rwanda, Hutus, and also the Tutsis. The minorities, the one who instituted those kinds of things. You don't need that kind of action to happen. There is an incentive under status quo. Done with model bashing. Secondly, Sanjeev's case, which they completely ignored. Annual policy is better for long-term change to happen if we fund productive elements. There were 3 things which Sanjeev told you. Number 1, their policy ferments capital flight. The point in which you massively reduce the amount of profit in which corporations can get means that they have a disincentive to invest in your country and they'll move out. They might want to say, but guys, we're only talking about development aid. But since you say that governments pay corporations by the money which they get through development aid, means the profit which these corporations get will be massively reduced, means they'll be compelled to move out from that country. We think that's a bad thing because jobs are gone, investments are gone, infrastructures which would have been built will be gone, satellite industries which should create more jobs, which should branch out towards other parts of society. People still use bridges, water and electricity, which affects all, not only one particular community, all will be gone. Secondly, Sanjeev told you about brain drain, right? In Venezuela, it is already bad enough that the Venezuelan doctor is paid less in contrast to a United States doctor. Now it's a double punishment for him. Not only is he paid less, now staying in that country means it will be taxed heavily, ladies and gentlemen, because the money through his salary is contingent upon the development in which he gets, the clinic or the hospital in which he sets up, ladies and gentlemen. That means you incentivize brain drain to happen. Again, no argument from that side. Thirdly, you told you about how this policy would reduce the foreign direct investment in 2 ways, in like lot of ways. Number 1, it becomes a negative signaling factor. Obviously, it will start out with the government or the international institutions controlling the transmission of it in a communistic way. But the point is, corporations are very perceptive. The point in which they see that some of our rights are being restricted gradually means they'll have the permanent disincentive for them to even invest in these countries, ladies and gentlemen, because they're already resentful, they're very cautious, and especially when you do not provide any element of certainty, they will move out. Sit down. But let's look at the characterization of these developing countries, right? There's already a natural disincentive for corporations to enter them to begin with. You need a big startup capital. You need to build infrastructures. You need a strong human capital in order for you to succeed. The point in which is the double barrier. The startup capital is so high. On top of that, when I enter, I need to follow all these ridiculous kinds of policies and preconditions which they want. They'll just move away. Because the characterization in developing countries, you must be friendly to a free market capital. If not, we'll push them away. Yeah.
So apparently all our conditions will make corrupt governments a lot worse. But suddenly when you say that all they have to do is channel it to productive elements, all the corruption's gone and everything's fine.
You know why I had to do that? I had to do best case scenario and worst case scenario. The best case scenario that we can channel it successfully towards institutions which they want, that will happen. If they can't, false illusion of representation will make situation worse. Because of you, mate. Secondly, so I agree, I will concede that yes, this is the second clash, right? I agree that at the same time that generally disparity would be there at the very beginning. But if you look at it, the level of poverty, a poor person in Singapore is significantly richer in contrast to a poor person in Venezuela. That long-term change means that yes, the threshold of poverty in this area will increase as more rich people get richer, as more private market and private capital is being built in this industry means that it naturally gets better. Shafiq told us that no, private corporations have no incentive to develop this system. It is simply untrue. Why? Because primarily, in order for these private corporations to succeed, they need to ensure that they build successful human capital here. If not, they are forced to bring in expensive expats to pay off monthly. It is better for you to build in private capital, to bring in institutions, to train the people of that country. Therefore, there's a natural incentive for that change to happen. Completely not like Shamila's argument, but now people run to China. Especially when it's bad, because China has no discipline at all. It doesn't care about corruption, it doesn't care about anything else. If your response that, well, you need to care about the West, they love the West. Africa, like the point is China is now becoming a global power, unfortunately, Brett. United States is moving out, it's getting weaker and weaker. Africa is now being colonized at one point in time. By China, your policy would make situation worse. I'm very happy to weed out, especially people like this, from debating.
Ladies and gentlemen, I want to pick off an example in Shafiq's speech. What does he want to do in Afghanistan? Make sure you have an equal number of female teachers or you pull the aid? Good luck. There is no level of social acceptability for that. Hello, welcome back, Taliban. Goodbye, everything we've done. This is why this model is just not sensitive to local realities, and that's where the China argument is actually a real risk. Too bad that they dropped that. Now, I'm sorry if they were too scared to defend the model. Maybe they should veto it. Maybe they should retire. Maybe they should spend less time in room parties and learn how to debate. Where are the checks and balances more likely, ladies and gentlemen? And why is this good or bad for investment and the economic health of the country as a whole? We talked to you about how these international institutions have technical advisors who've actually studied these things, right? And these people are invested in making the businesses work. Their jobs kind of depend upon it if they give crap advice, right? And so, because you're invested in making sure the businesses work, there are several incentives at play there. For one, you're invested in building a consumer market as well to buy those things and services. Number two, you're invested in building a talent pool and a human resource base, which I said, because otherwise who's going to staff your businesses? But you're also invested in some degree of a social license to operate. That was my POI to Shafiq. He ignored it. Obviously, you're not going to steamroll your way into those communities because that's a recipe for violence. So there's a natural incentive to be somewhat consultative. But we don't agree with this straitjacket model because it's just really, really dangerous. It's all or nothing. It's not context specific. But they say, look guys, it's not fair. How come the checks and balances get to work under your model, but they don't get to work under ours? And that's why we're being model specific, because your model was soft, because your model was a checklist model. As long as you have 3 curves there, in Shafiq's words, we're good. As long as you have a woman there, we're good. There's no qualitative assessment. Because if it was going to be qualitative and structural and systematic, you would have debated the debate that you were supposed to debate. But no, it was a checklist, right? You throw right from their mouths. So very easy to co-opt. But let's assume the worst, right? I mean, let's assume the best, I'm sorry. That it has some teeth, that these people are representing genuine interests, and that there are real conflicts happening. We said it's going to deter investment. Why? Because there's a huge risk of stalemates. There's a huge risk of discussion dragging on and on and on. There's a huge risk of paralysis because every group wants to forward their own interest. The only response from Shafiq finally was, it's not so hard, you know. We just put 3 Kurds there and they're all going to agree. If they were all going to agree so easily, then we probably had no problem, right? If they were all going to agree so easily, then this is not so unequitable. There are no real conflicts. There are no real strong investments in the issue. This is likely to be a decision where you're going to have to make a choice, where something has to give, where not everyone can be happy right away. We were willing to defend that. We were willing to defend the power of eminent domain for extractive industries. We were willing to defend not giving everyone what they wanted yet, erring on the side of technical advisors. Why? And we explained the process. We said we'd rather signal to people to keep investing in our country. We don't want businesses to feel that it's too risky. The more they invest, the more jobs they create, the more profits they generate. It's not a perfect model, but it is one that works. It is not one that can either get hijacked by the government or lead to decision-making paralysis that drives away investors. Again, they did not respond to that point at all. So if there is absolutely no conflict and the women would have been on board, all the indigenous people would have been on board, then we have no problem. We're both happy with that agreement in this debate. They probably would have already been consulted anyway. But what happens when they don't agree? What are you going to do? Who are you going to follow? Are you going to drive away the businesses? That question, complete silence from this side of the house. That is why I think we take this debate.
Mr. Speaker, let's take the hate out of this room. Let us bring back love, because love heals all wounds. I've been called many things in my life, Mr. Speaker, so when I get calls like I should retire and that I'm disgusting, I find them the least of my concern. What I'm concerned right now is that, actually I'm not concerned, I'm delighted is that I'm ahead in the debate and I'm likely to win. And I had a team on the other side that's upset about that. And if you're going to talk about soft cases, I can give you a litany of soft cases that involve all the members on the other side, but that would just be history. But I don't want to read anybody out because we believe the debating world should include all peoples, because it becomes merrier that way. Everyone's been complaining that I don't set up enough the debate, and this time I get up and I set a debate and they say it's too specific. If it's too specific, that's your issue. It really is. And if you think that we ignored a lot of your first speaker, it's because he tried to ignore the specificity of our issue, of our case. He wanted to debate what they set up, which forced them to shift speeches. Because we got towards the end, the third speaker, he said, well, it was difficult for me to contain my speech and have actually any structure or positive material because I was dealing with best case, worst case, and I have to work my way towards between both. But we did hear when we asked the question earlier from them, we said, where are the conditions that you want? Because they said we need conditions too. So there was no real proposal from them other than the fact that we need to let things be. Because they spent a lot of time talking about how corrupt these countries can be and how nothing works. And at the same time they say everything we propose will fail because these countries generally fail on all tests. That's not an argument against our proposal, that's an argument against these countries, Mr. Speaker. That's the whole way that they've approached it. The second speaker on that side, and we would like to say the first speech from that side, focused on the fact that she would like to recalibrate the debate and how what is good or bad debating. But that does not change the fact that all her speech was discussing how all these conditions that we propose can be abused. And at the same extent, never explaining how all the conditions that the mystery conditions that they will defend will never be abused. Because then it's the debating up in the air. And debating up in the air is not a bad good thing because you tend to fall. Mr. Speaker, what have we provided in this debate? We provided a proposal that all funders, when they provide this funding for developing aid to these developing countries, developing, underdeveloped, and post-conflict, will ensure that the money they give and the project specific to that money will have, Mr. Speaker, aggressive social redistributive policies. It's not about 3 cuts or 6 cuts. I'll even give you 2 cuts. 2 cuts and 3 half cuts. What do you get? That's like a start of a joke, Mr. Speaker. We talked about the fact that the main source, and that's what we got towards the third speaker, when he started talking about the fact that actually it has a lot of reach, our proposal. And we also talked about the fact that it's consistent with the values of the funders, and we also talked about the fact that it creates a working model where even if it's a smaller project, that eventually the countries themselves will co-opt it. Just because it's not the arguments you're prepared for doesn't mean they don't matter. And just because you can't answer everything we say doesn't mean it's bad debating. Mr. Speaker, this debate is about the funders. This debate is about the developing nation. This debate is about whether you can achieve those targets with the policy that we proposed, I think it was me, many minutes ago. It's not that fictional debate they have on the other side, and it's too bad that they're going to be disappointed. We beg to propose.
Congratulations to all the debaters. Thank you for the memorable round.
Thank you.
You're done. You're back.